There we go. There it is. So we'll do some preliminaries, including just touch base about membership. We'll want to kind of hear from each of the three subcommittees who actually discussed kind of the scope of this group a little bit more. And then we want to kind of walk through the recommendations from the Ag and Eco subcommittee to decide kind of what's within our scope and what may be covered by other entities or efforts. And then we'll do some final planning before we close at 5. So that's the plan. Any questions about the agenda? Good. And we will have a chance for public comment at the end. Everyone is free to use chat. Just please be judicious, because sometimes it can get to be a little bit much and then it's distracting, and we would rather not have that. So just be judicious is all I ask. Okay, I think we want to do approve minutes of the March 3rd and March 14th meetings. Jane sent that information out ahead of time. So are there any additions or corrections to either of those minutes? And Judy just did that. If you are a member of the task group or work, it would be great to actually have your video on. And if you are an excellent and a welcome member of the public, if you have your video off, just so I can keep track of people, that would be great. Any additions or corrections to the minutes? Okay, hearing no objections or additions or corrections, I will assume that those meeting minutes are approved. Okay, membership, Jane, do you want to give us an update kind of on where we're at with membership?
Yeah, so, well, first I wanted to welcome Richard Hopkins. It was partially, admittedly, an oversight on my part of not including him from the onset. So Richard serves on science and data, and he's been, consistently interested in this topic from the onset of the formation of that subcommittee, as well as a member of the life cycle analysis task group. And so, barring any objections, at the science and data subcommittee, it was somewhat arbitrary that science and data was underrepresented on this task group. We had 3 reps from cross-sector, 3 from Ag and Eco, and we now have 2 official reps from science and data, Megan and Richard. So assuming that seems to be in line with other subcommittees and obviously still have less representation. So welcome to Richard. I'm really excited that he'll bring his expertise in that space. Richard, maybe before I move on, if you would just want to introduce yourself and give some background of your interest here.
Yeah, I'm a retired public health official. It's not obvious why that qualifies me to be a member of this group. I was an epidemiologist for the several different state health departments, including the Florida State Health Department, for 20-some years. When I retired, I got interested in climate issues and tried to teach myself something about the data issues related to greenhouse gases. I was honored to be appointed to the Science and Data Subcommittee back when not too long after it formed, and I've been participating since then. I have had a consistent bee in my bonnet about burning wood for heat, and so I want to listen very carefully to what people say about burning wood for heat in today's meeting. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Richard. Nice to have you. Welcome, Liz. Thanks for joining.
So, yeah, thanks for joining, Liz. And then for everybody, maybe I'll let him do the honors, but one of our esteemed colleagues at ANR is transitioning into a new role outside of state government and will be stepping down as Commissioner of Department of Environmental Conservation and in his role on cross-sector. So as a result, we'll need to step down from this task group. So Peter, if you just want to maybe just say a word or 2 about your role here and then where you're going, that'd be great. And then I'll speak to the transition there.
Sure. I am grateful for all of you for working through these challenging issues. I have, in all of the work that we've done on the council as a whole, I hope that I may be able to stay involved in some way in my future role, which is, related. My last day at DEC is the 15th of April, and on the 9th of May, I will take over as Managing Director of Efficiency Vermont. So there's I hope to continue to support the work of the council in some form, but that remains to be seen.
Great. So, and Peter and Jane, so I assume cross-sector then will find a replacement for Peter in the coming weeks as he steps away.
I'd just like to say, I don't think there is such a thing. So we will be challenged as the now only cross-sector member who will be with continuity. But Peter, that's really great. And we're going to miss you on this one.
Peter, will say an alternative to Peter, not a replacement.
Yeah, I like that. So yeah, stay tuned, but the composition continues to shift a little, and my apologies for that with the consistency to the work, but we'll bring somebody forward and make sure we bring them up to speed as the work continues. So thanks. So
Great.
That's all I have on that for now. Just wanted to provide that space.
Great, Jane, thanks. Great. So I think I don't want this to be too long, so we need to kind of get to this group tangibly going through the items to identify where they fit in our scope so we can get going. But I think we want to hear briefly, each of the subcommittees discussed the scope of this group a little bit more among themselves. And I'd like to hear each of the members of the subcommittee of this work group who sat on that subcommittee, just to give a quick reflection on what you talked about or kind of what conclusions that subcommittee had regarding kind of our tasks that we've laid out. We have that bulleted or lettered list from the Ag and Eco. And so what your subcommittee thought about those tasks and kind of where they fit. So I'd like to kind of turn to the Ag and Eco subcommittee members here in the work group. Then I'll turn to the cross sector and the science and data and just give a little reflection of the conversation you had about the scope for this group. And then we will actually look very concretely about the scope line by line. So I don't know, Charlie, Billy, Judy, who wants to start just to give a flavor from your subcommittee's conversation about the scope for the biomass group.
I'm happy to defer to Charlie or Judy or go. So Charlie said, Billy, go. Judy, would you like to go for it or you want me to kick it off?
Kick it off.
Okay.
What I recall is it was only an hour and we didn't have a lot of time.
Yep. Yeah, thanks. So we met, I think, last Friday. We only met for an hour. We had a couple more topics to cover. We had a brief discussion about the work of this group so far. And I think the substantive piece we talked about was a couple things, whether the kind of siloed nature of the climate council's work and the subcommittees lent itself well to the kind of cross-cutting issues associated with biomass and the kind of gaps that resulted therein. And then the question of whether the work of this task group might pause or be reliant on information coming out of the greenhouse gas inventory. And I think there was a discussion that maybe some pieces of our work are dependent on that analysis and need the weight, but that there's certainly other elements of the charge that could be, that this group could continue to work on. So I think those were my takeaways, and Judy and Charlie, certainly please feel free to modify or edit that.
Any additions, Judy or Charlie?
Billy left the meeting early, and at the end, we totally agreed to keep the committee going and to get answers to the questions we have and the recommendations we suggested to the council.
Charlie, anything else to add? No. Okay. All right. Good. All right. Cross sector.
I'll jump in first, and then Liz and TJ, please add as you see fit. We had a wide-ranging conversation about the recommendations from Ag and Eco, because frankly, it was not something that our subcommittee had gone into in great detail before, the specific recommendations. And so there was a lot of conversation around whether we had the information necessary to answer some of the questions and to have a discussion about them and which ones we could move forward with. And there was the decision made, there was a lot of discussion around whether or not we try to kind of clarify what the scope is with the council, but we decided ultimately that we'd come back to this group with some ideas around, what we thought was included in the cap and addressed, what might be within the scope or what, and answerable now, and then what we need additional information on. So there are certainly some things we think aren't necessarily ripe right now for conversation that we need some more information on in order to have the robust and kind of full and complete conversation that we think is necessary. But there are certainly some things now that don't rely on additional information or different forms of knowledge that we can rely on here. But that was kind of the general takeaway from our discussion. Frankly, it was a lot of sort of introduction to the issue. We had a number of folks bring up sort of where we are now in terms of the use of the consideration of biomass in various forms and different decisions that have outside of this body and outside of the council that have sort of set precedent in the state so far, and that some of those are mentioned in the document that Jane shared in terms of sharing some of that kind of lived experience. Whether it's the right answer or not, that's kind of where we've been as a state, and it would be good to understand what those decisions were and why they were made.
Liz
or TJ, you have anything more to add to that?
No, that sounds right. I think it's worth, I guess, saying that committee members, and I'd include myself among those, but you've heard it here too, we're struggling with how to even kind of characterize the things that we could decide and offer recommendations now versus may need to wait and hear that further information, because it's as many will appreciate, as you start to talk about this, the complexities become pretty significant and the nuances are there. So we did have some discussion about that on the subcommittee, and how much of what is on the recommendation list now can kind of come to recommendation and conclusion for the full council without some of those foundational steps.
And then
maybe I might add that Patrick, just the like to put a kind of a circle around that. I think one of the things that is this was like a starting point, rough pass, trying to make sure we understood it. And if, as we have conversations about specific topics that are, each one of the items in here has obviously a ton of, information and specifics behind it, that I think we sort of would want to make sure that we still have the information that we need. So it's not sort of a final list from things that we think are fully ready. We just think they're worthy of a conversation to understand if they're ready, and whether or not we can make a group decision, or whether we come to an impasse, or what have you.
Good. Or we come, Peter, I think is Liz hinted to, come to the point where you have a good discussion on this group and you say, we just need more X to be able to know really where to go here. So in terms of information, knowledge, learning. Okay, good. Science and data. Megan.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I can give a quick update of we had some discussion of the work of this group in the Science and Data Subcommittee. And as some folks might be aware, a big project in the Science and Data Subcommittee has been work in the life cycle analysis space. And so to the extent the work of this group overlaps with that investigation and analysis, that's kind of where our discussion was focused in our subcommittee meeting. And so I guess just to remind folks really briefly, the RFI, the request for information that we recently released to inform the request for proposals to figure out the kind of design and implementation of a life cycle analysis in Vermont, as was recommended in the Climate Action Plan, is focused specifically on energy supply. And so the way that we define energy supply in the RFI is including but not limited to electricity, including renewable, hydro, solar, wind, and nuclear generation, liquid fuels for transportation and heating, including biofuels, gaseous fuels, including renewable fuels, and solid fuels, including wood. So obviously, to the extent that we are including biomass emissions in our life cycle analysis, obviously that's relevant to this group. And so we will be including that in that work. And so I think we had, that was where our discussion was mostly overlapping with this group, and how, those pieces are going to fit into that investigation, and where we are with that. RFP is waiting to see what the steering committee decides on Monday regarding funding of that work. We're going to need to hire a contractor to help us figure out how to design that tool. So they, you know, if that funding is allocated to a life cycle analysis, then we will be able to move forward with issuing the RFP. And I believe that members of this group have been added to our task group that's working specifically on the life cycle analysis RFP to help inform the biomass piece of that.
Great, thank you,
And
Richard.
Jane, please let me know if there's anything I missed in that update.
And Richard, let me kind of any additions you want to make, and then I'll go to Judy's question in chat.
I have nothing to add. Thanks.
So I think, Judy, is your question pertinent to the life cycle cost work, whether there's an equity component?
Yes.
And Megan, is there explicitly in the RFI or the RFP that would be released if there's money, a piece of that life cycle cost that has an equity component or follows the equity principles of the council?
We didn't call specifically in our request for information for feedback on how we would incorporate that into a life cycle analysis. That is a good question.
And that may be one that's important to bring back to that life cycle group to think about the just transition principles and whether there's allocation effects in life cycle costing you can look at that might have an equity component. Judy, does that at least names the issue? Thanks,
Yeah,
Judy.
thank you.
Yeah, and I'd have to defer to others in the life cycle group that are more familiar with how those analyses are usually structured and whether or not that's factored in. So that's kind of a little out of my wheelhouse, but we'll think about that.
But with the Judy, go ahead.
Just so you know, Megan, the guiding principles address equity for all non-living and living things.
Thank you, Judy.
So then I think with all of the conversations you had in your subcommittees to inform, what I think we as a work group need to do is kind of march through these line items. And I think Jane has got kind of a proposition to test with the group in terms of where we kind of focus ourselves. And what I encourage us to do is to find a way forward so we can get into the work and not have to keep talking about scope. So I'm not asking for everyone to love with where we head, but we need to start somewhere. So let's hope by the end of the day we can have even if it's an uncomfortable agreement about at least where to start in terms of our work, because I think people are anxious to dive into the substance of which that they agree is within scope. So that, Jane, do you want to pull up that document and let's actually just kind of walk through that. There are questions in chat. I'm not going to address them right now. I'm going to keep us focused on our task. I'm happy during public comment or if we have time. And the reason being public is I really want this group to identify its scope so we can get to work. And then we can definitely tackle some of these really good substantive questions.
Sorry, I'm not sure why it's not finding the window. Let me just open it a different way. Give me 1 second.
Jane, Zoom loves you. That's why you can't find it.
Definitely it. Oh, come on. There it is. So I want to let Pat walk through this with you all, but thought I would just say that the basic premise of this was the foundational statement was something that I drafted based on feedback that I heard from all of you around what I felt like was percolating up from the subcommittees, just around this understanding of shared learning, and then also an understanding around how best to proceed, like sequentially based on assuming knowledge is needed before we could make some recommendations in certain spaces. And then the definition was just me carrying that forward to remind us of the definition that we've somewhat agreed upon as a group based on the definition put forward by Ag and Eco. So this is the same definition from those tabled actions. And then intended for discussion today is really my attempt at just putting something out as a straw man for what we would take forward from these tabled actions based on where I tend to believe the Climate Council has already settled some of these issues through priority policy recommendations that were adopted in the CAP. Those are therefore highlighted in red based on the adoption primarily of the clean heat standard as a primary policy recommendation and the advancement of thermal wood and heat in that space. And then below that, yellow is still are unresolved needed questions, but felt like they were within scope for the life cycle analysis group to have needed work done on them still, and therefore should not be discussed by this group. Sometimes some of them maybe ever, because they'll be answered by the life cycle analysis themselves, and some being revisited once the life cycle analysis is done. So, and then the blue, the ones I saw as blue were the ones that clearly felt like were legitimate questions for this group right now to sort of head down a path to start to grapple with. And so I made some, were some comments that I put forward that I'm just starting to think about, and some issues around some of the actions, but we can discuss those. And I really feel like the conversation today should focus on that red, yellow, and blue grouping that I did and make sure that there's agreement there.
Peter.
Peter, I see your hand up, so go ahead.
Just wanted to suggest that we may need another color category as sort of another that doesn't conveniently fit into one of those buckets, but is for whatever reason not ready to be in scope, if that makes sense. And just so that we have that available to us for discussion.
Yeah. And it may be some things are blue, some things blue might be we're all ready to dive right in and have a discussion and come to recommendations. Some things in blue might be we need to discuss them, we're not quite sure what happens to them, which, and I don't know if that partly addresses your point, but we'll kind of try to parse that as we go. Charlie.
Thanks, Matt. Just a quick clarification on the comments to consider. Could we do a quick, just brief, what the PUC's North Springfield decision was? That's not ringing a bell for me.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Yeah, that would, Jane, could you share what that is? I think I know it is, but I'm not talking.
Yeah, so that just kept getting thrown around by VNRC staff as precedents around decisions in biomass. And I wonder if, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but there are other people on this call who might understand that better than me. And I did just get a copy of it from Jamie Fidel at VNRC, so I could read through it, but I didn't get any kind of summary with it, and it's a meaty document. So Billy, if you have some basis of that, that's great if you can follow up. I just wanted to flag it as being likely relevant to the work of this group.
Yeah, I don't know that this raises to the level of these bullets. I think it's like any piece of additional information. This was a highly technical and highly specific case about a new electric-led biomass facility in North Springfield. The commission did make some findings and address emissions as part of their order, but this is one where the details matter, and I don't think we can draw broad conclusions from it. So that's all I'll say. It's fine. It's a great. It was a lot of the issues we're going to discuss were explored in great depth over the course of this proceeding. I think it's a fine thing to share with folks. I just don't know that we can draw any ultimate conclusions from it.
Maybe what we do, Bill, to your point, is we make it available to folks. They can look at it and decide how it is or isn't relevant to our conversation. Richard.
Yeah, thanks. I think I was appointed to the Data and Science Subcommittee partly because of my background as an epidemiologist, and I have rarely used that background in these conversations. But I do want to point out that although burning wood for heat can be made pretty safe from a health point of view using advanced wood systems, in general, burning wood for heat in the home is one of the worst ways to heat your home from a health point of view. And we're not really considering the health impacts of in the home or in the community of the particulates and other substances produced by burning wood.
Thanks, Richard. Judy.
Jane, is this the procedure or the things you want us to discuss today? Okay, because this list of things is different than the recommendations we sent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So that was just some opening statements.
Okay.
I'll say, and then this is the exact list of your stuff, and that's where I've done the color coding that Pat is going to walk us through.
Thank you.
Good. No, Judy, that's good. So I think I'd like to kind of, those caveats are things we can add, subtract from. I think Billy, was helpful for him to clarify that one decision. But I think let's kind of just start walking through this. So and Jane, I may ask you or others for clarification when we go through this. So the first thing you have in red, which suggests it's not, it's already taken up by other parts of the cap, and that's address the use of biomass for appropriately scaled institutional and residential thermal heat generation. And I'm assuming you put that in red because the clean heat standard for better or for worse covers that, or were you thinking something different about that first clause?
I put it there largely because we, as the council, I didn't, but the council adopted a clean heat standard with one of the clean heat measures as thermal wood heat.
Okay. So
the idea that we're yeah, please go ahead, Peter. Sorry.
I would just add to that that one of the considerations of the clean heat standard as it's been working its way through the legislature is a specific analysis of issues such as the climate mitigation and co-benefits and the impacts associated with it of all clean heat measures. So not just biomass, but other things that could be used as well. And so that, to my mind, really, we could probably include, I think it's maybe my only friendly recommendation would be that we expand that red bar to include climate mitigation, co-benefits, and impacts, because that will be part of that analysis.
So I think the thought is here is because the council acted, I mean, the legislature is taking it up. The broader discussion of this is probably out of our hands at this point. So we could talk about all we want, but it probably wouldn't have necessarily a lot of influence. And that's why it would not, that broad conversation would not necessarily be in scope. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I might be repeating what Peter just said, and I apologize if I am, but my reading of the legislation, the Clean Heat Standard legislation, is that although it gives a list of kinds of measures that would be considered for credits for clean heat, that it also has this provision that each proposed measure would be evaluated as to its impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So there's not a guarantee that a proposal for advanced wood heat would necessarily generate clean heat credits, depending on how it was scored in that process. Is that right?
Is that correct, Peter?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
So again,
that understanding is part of why I have been so supportive of the clean heat standard.
Great, thanks, Richard. So again, it's not because this isn't worthy of discussion. It's just that it's kind of been taken up outside of the hands of the council, that this first part with maybe the red added, because the legislation covers those things that Peter just said, would kind of not be the focus of this group. There are many other things that would be, but so I wanted to see if anybody has any questions about that. And the rationale for why that broad piece wouldn't be for the discussion for this group. Any questions about that?
Maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but isn't that sentence or part of the sentence in red kind of like an umbrella for a lot of the things that are in blue? Maybe I'm not reading this the right way, but it seems like a lot of the stuff in blue is looking to address, I mean, it's an overarching statement and not a specific one. I mean, we can get rid of it if you want. To me, it's like the other things under here are kind of couched in this broad, general, this is what we're going to look at kind of thing.
Everything else that follows is about electric generation.
I mean, Charlie, part of I'm with you a little bit. I don't want to get too caught up in this first number one, because it's in some ways a very broad framing.
Oh, okay. Well, Billy just kind of helped me understand a little bit. I guess.
Yeah.
Action one, specific to electric generation. Okay, I guess I see that clearer here, because things that get down below are on thermal and biomass. Okay, that makes a little bit more sense. Sorry, I have a bad cold, so my head is a little bit in a fog. So I think I get what you're saying.
No, Charlie, your question was a good one. I had a similar one. You're all good. Judy.
Yeah, I had the same question, because that statement in red that you want to take out is exactly the root of everything we talked about.
Judy, what do you mean at root? Just say a little bit more about that.
Well, it's all, we talked about you know, residential heat was very different than institutional heat and large scale heat. And we needed to learn more and compare some of that. And then everything that came up after that focused on that one sentence.
Well, what I'd like to do this is I'm going to come back to this top one. I think the point, my understanding is that Jane was maybe trying to make was simply that there's a number of things in the heat standard that are going to take up the broad question of, again, thermal heat as part of a clean heat standard. And as Richard said, there is in the legislation, at least that's currently in development, who knows how till the cows come home, so to speak, that actually does also have measurement or scoring for impacts, co-benefits, et cetera. But I think let's focus for now going forward. We can come back to this first clause in a minute. I think the next piece is really talking about that next clause, which is the broad statement is preventing the expansion of biomass for industrial scale commercial electricity production. Then A and the subparts that follow all are really very relevant to that. And Jane, I think the only question then that you're suggesting is really something that's actually covered under the life cycle effort is A. So we just want to say a little bit more about why A would fall out, but and go somewhere else, quote unquote.
I think that's largely a lot of the basic premise that you need the life cycle analysis in order to even understand how we're accounting for biomass, and then how we're thinking about the idea of setting emission reduction targets in that space. And not to mention, we also have, it's about the accounting of biomass, and we already have emission reduction targets as set in law by statute. So it's like, it feels like a complicated comment there, and we definitely need the life cycle analysis to even think about the greenhouse gas emissions.
Judy, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't put it down.
No worries. So I think we really would spend a lot of time talking about existing facilities and whether or not this group does or doesn't agree on expansion, what we mean by expansion, and then a number of the other pieces here about remediating or mitigating negative impacts. But we'd kind of leave some of the accounting to the life cycle group to continue to carry forward. Liz, go ahead.
I just want to raise, this was among the things on at least my mind, maybe others on the cross-sector committee. I don't know how we will successfully discuss existing plants and potential expansions or changes in uses in existing plants without that. It feels intertwined with that information. I'll just put it that way. And it in some ways feels intertwined with thermal, because some of the proposals, which I think from what I've seen could be beneficial, include expansion to thermal uses. So anyway, our ability to successfully separate expansions related to electricity generation versus expansions of facilities may be hampered.
And I think one of the either good parts or the challenges of this, what's in blue over here around the two existing plants anyway, is a lot of this is probably policy-based value judgments informed by science versus like kind of just the core science. And so that's why probably we could talk about it. It may not be easy to talk about. Liz, to your point, there's going to be things we may not know to be able to actually come to some conclusions. And I think if people can agree this is, we can talk about it, but recognizing that we may lack data, information, or whatever to reach conclusions may be possible, right, when we have that conversation.
Patrick?
Judy?
Talking about it is what's important. One of the things that I experienced last week is there's people on this committee who work for the agency. And I realize the only extent I have in asking them for things is as a taxpayer, which is probably meaningless. But as a member of this committee, if we need information to answer our questions, to talk about this, do we have the right to request that information?
Right.
So for instance, what Megan was talking about earlier, can we have copies of that? And last week we talked about the carbon emissions that is coming from the CO2 and the nitrous oxide that's coming from McNeil. And I requested a chart that exists, but it wasn't forthcoming. So how do we get that information if we're going to just talk about it?
So a question, this I think goes back probably to A&R, but like if this group is talking about, I don't know, just to name a plant, McNeil, and we have a question about current emissions or the footprint, or if there was a cultural resource study done at some point, can we then, this group, make a request of A&R, whatever, to make available whatever information is publicly available and for them to be able to be responsive?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, so I understand that,
Yeah.
that Judy, maybe Megan can help clarify. I thought that Megan provided that information to you.
She
that-
did not provide it all. She did suggest I contact someone else, and I did, and I never got the information.
Okay, we can address that. I think certainly any information that the agency has and the ability to share, I think we're happy to do so. I see Colin, who may be the person that you asked, has his hand up. It might be useful to hear from.
Colin, go ahead.
Thanks, Peter. Judy, I believe that I definitely put together that chart that mimicked the one that you sent me the link to for McNeil, that had the emissions, I believe it was for 2020, of various pollutants, not just greenhouse gases for McNeil. I did not answer your second question about the number of vehicles that would equate to, because I don't think that's a fair linkage to make at this point. When, if you just assume that there is no sequestration associated, that might be fair, but I don't think that we have totally come to that conclusion yet. And so that is why I did not respond. And I had heard that you had put together your own estimate of the number of vehicles that equated to. So I didn't think that you needed that any longer.
Judy,
Well, according to Jane's letter, there's already an existing chart that does comparisons. And so I passed along her email to see the chart.
Judy, I have a question. I'm going to make a comment about chat. Judy, did you get the chart from Colin?
The first one, yes, not the second one.
Okay. And the second one was relating to the comparison to cars.
No.
Oh, okay.
The second one was in comparison to things in general. How much carbon does a car give out? How much carbon does a motorcycle give out? How much carbon does, a lawnmower give out? All of those type of things is what I was looking for.
Got you. And Colin, is there a kind of a relative carbon emissions chart or information or table that is available?
Well, I'm sorry, Judy, I never got that request. But there are things like that. I think EPA has a carbon equivalency calculator. I think it's EPA. It might be another larger environmental organization. I can put a link to that in the chat if it would be helpful. It may not have all the equivalencies you're looking for, but it will likely have some. But I will just say for those that there's a lot of nuance and details that are built into all of those tools as well. And it's a simple answer to a not simple question. So I just want to flag that in using those tools.
Okay. All right, folks in chat, this is what I do want to avoid. We're having a whole side technical conversation about something that is kind of distracting, frankly, for me and maybe for others. So I would ask that people refrain from that. I'm actually turning chat off. I'm not going to look at it for a minute because I need us to focus on our scope here, and the chat is getting a little back and forth that I think is frankly distracting. So that's, sometimes it can be really, really helpful. I appreciate people's passion, but I also want to help us focus. And so people can use chat judiciously. And when we're ready to dive into substance and people have, additional things to add and they have additional citations, great. But I'd ask we'll hold off on that for right now. TJ, go ahead.
As long as that previous conversation is resolved, I wanted to go back up to the yellow and 1A there. And I got kicked off Zoom or whatever. So sorry if I missed this, but this is for, in yellow is for the life cycle analysis group to look at. Is this the area where, Peter suggested we might have another caller to come back and look at, because that's maybe question one, but maybe more to the point is, one, I don't think the life cycle analysis group is going to set emissions reductions targets. And two, I'm not sure that this group should be setting emissions reduction targets for specific facilities with licenses. So if we are going to talk about it later, I think it should have a whether it's appropriate for us to set emissions reductions targets for specific facilities within the umbrella of kind of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the policy levers that we have.
TJ, could we, on this one, could we note, one, is there maybe some, again, work that's happening in the life cycle? Two, can we actually maybe just discuss this more, and I don't want to do it right now, but broadly, like what authorities either the state or EPA have in actually setting specific GHG reduction targets for individual facilities? Because maybe there's just some policy understanding we could all have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could talk about that. That's like a precursor to having any conversation here. Yeah, and we can do that when the appropriate time is.
So I think TJ, I think if I heard right, I think we're kind of raising on this yellow, there's kind of a pre-question to it, recognizing also part of it's tied to the life cycle piece. So Jane, maybe there's, I know this is a PDF, but maybe there's a way to make note of that as, you know, we need to kind of understand policy jurisdictions here as well as life cycle work. And maybe we come back to the specifics after we look at both, which may not be right away.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think there's an additional layer of complexity to that, you know, along sort of what our existing authorities are to set different regulatory standards, and then how do we derive that authority? And there is indication in the Global Warming Solutions Act about what the climate action plan sets forth as part of the plan that that ANR shall follow when setting regulatory levels, but it really is specific to ANR, and that may not be the case here necessarily. Those levels might come into play also at the PUC or in other contexts. And so we need to do some more research here before I feel comfortable. And since it won't be, we're also in that gray area of these were tabled actions from the CAP. Are they ultimately going, the recommendations of this group going to get re-included in the CAP? That's a sort of open question, and one that I think the legal authority derives from. So I would just put a pin in that as well. We don't need to talk about it now, but definitely need to do more work in this space.
I think there's some good policy discussion here, more about like framework and jurisdiction, or kind of umbrella, whatever the right words are, stage setting. And maybe that's the most important conversation under A right now, not actually doing the task that's described just yet. Okay. All right. Judy, do you have any other questions on information you needed before we move on to B? You're good. Okay. So the next piece is a little complicated. So the way I see it broadly to help, and I may not have a quite framework quite right either, is in some ways what we're saying is the scope of this group is one, to focus specifically on existing large industrial scale electricity producing biomass plants, of which there are 2 in the state, I believe. And as described in the blue footprint, that's task 1, recognizing we may lack information, all the things that Liz raised. And then the other task is really to talk about, really, when you think about fuel source for thermal, typically those big plants, or potentially even, you know, commercial thermal. We're not debating whether or not thermal should or shouldn't happen if that's left with the heat standard, but really about the complicated understanding and trade-offs between wood as a fuel source, say as in pellets, and wood as a means to sequester and or store carbon as in forest. And that complex story, I think, is what's going to flow in a lot of what follows after C, which is, I think, D. So, but we'll explore this as we need to. So that's why B is a little complicated, because the Buchholz, that's how you say his name, report does try to actually understand what kinds of wood flows or wood fuel sources would be carbon neutral and which ones wouldn't be, under what conditions. That's why it's left in blue for our discussion, because it's about kind of the fuel source and the role of wood. And then the red, though, really is much more related to the fuel standard that the legislature is now taking up, which is, again, why it's not that it's not important to talk about, it's kind of outside of our hands at this point. So that's why it's divided into 2. So questions or comments about B? Anything I wasn't clear on, please ask for. Peter.
I guess I'm always a little wary of calling out one piece of research if we're going to consider all available research. And this one, you know, I think there's probably a lot of value in its discussion based on what you just provided, but it's about local wood pellets rather than the sort of sweep of biomass that we're defined. And so I do wonder whether it's appropriate to call it out. I'm not saying we don't evaluate it. I'm just saying that it seems odd in my mind specifically to call that one out.
Charlie.
But you all drafted this in the Ag and Eco, and I don't want to, step on your toes. I just want to understand it better.
I think Charlie will probably, I think he might.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Peter, and I think that your comments are in line with generally what I recall. And I think the idea, if the phrasing was not correct, the idea here was to basically say, hey, there's existing research out there. Here's an example of one. If we're going to have further discussions to look at stuff, let's look at the research, invite them in, talk to them. So if this comes across as singling out one study, it wasn't specifically that this is the only one. It was more just, again, there's research out there that looks at this. Let's look to that to inform decision making. So that could have been phrased better, maybe.
But I think Charlie and Judy, others, I think, right, the intent was really utilize existing research, of which there are many things we then will need to explore as this group, and identifying experts and the like to then talk about. So that's just one. It's an important one, but it's by no means the only one. Judy.
I'm trying to understand why you want to take out the red part, because that was something we discussed at great lengths. For example, the definition of biomass on the front gate of McNeil doesn't even agree with ours. So there has to be some discussion there about what's going to happen with these places to inform and under what condition biomass is institutional, or, I mean, we have to discuss this because not everybody even has the same definition we have.
So I think, Judy, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jan, if you had a different intent, is like, for instance, what you just described is what is McNeil using, is it in keeping with or not the definition we have, and why is there a difference? I think that's all in scope for this group. I think what the red is trying to suggest is that the kind of questions about which thermal is better than or not, all those things are kind of at this point in the clean heat standard realm now. So so broadly, we wouldn't kind of be relitigating the clean heat standard. But what you just said relevant to McNeil would be absolutely in scope. But Jane, tell me if I have that wrong.
So yeah, I mean, I guess I saw that, or I see a portion of that around education and outreach and communication tools in the space, and certainly see that as being beyond just the general public and targeted at communication with McNeil or Rygate if we chose to do so, and thinking about that.
Richard, go for it.
Do you go back up to the red so we can see what we're all talking about? Thank you.
Richard.
Am I on?
You're on. You're good.
Yeah, okay. So I've been thinking about whether the conclusions you would reach about sustainability would be different if you're looking at wood products burned for electricity versus wood or wood products burned for building heat. And at first I thought, well, you know, they shouldn't be separated because the renewability is the same in either case. The difference is, I think, that wood burned for heat provides heat that is used directly. Wood that is burned to generate electricity goes through an efficiency losing step in the conversion from wood heat to electricity, which makes it a much less efficient use of the wood to produce useful work. And I think that's my thinking is now is that that's why it makes sense to separate the analysis of wood for heat versus wood for electricity. I hope that's similar to other people's understanding.
I agree. And I think just to oversimplify, the way I read this marked up document that Pat and Jane prepared is that many of the things in red are addressed by the clean heat standard. Basically, any thermal application of wood fuel that's referenced in this document is marked in red because it's covered by the clean heat standard. Anything that deals with inventorying of greenhouse gas emissions associated with biomass is marked in yellow, since there's a separate group focused on that. and everything else that focuses on kind of the operations of existing and new electric-led power plants, biomass plants in the state is remaining in scope for this task group. I think that was the intent, and that's something I think makes sense. But I just wanted to kind of reiterate how I understood the framing. If I have that wrong, please let me know.
Billy, I think that was, unless Jane disagrees, I think that was said clearly. So that was, thank you for trying to summarize. I think that's the intent here. And I think, Richard, to your point, and Jane, correct me wrong, I think when we talk about kind of fuel source, which is the wood, pellets or otherwise, and that complicated equation between wood as fuel versus wood as storage, I'm not sure we differentiated wood for electricity versus wood for thermal, to Richard's point. I think I'm not sure the ag ecosystem went that far when we went to look back at pellets, for instance.
And I just, if I could just clarify what I was trying to say is that for any given amount of work, any given amount of energy that is developed, you got to cut down more forest to make electricity than you do to heat a house.
And Richard, you asked a good question, like with a technical question about kind of what's the thermal conversion between the two and efficiencies in big plants versus home wood stoves. And I have no idea what the answer is. It's a great question. Peter.
I just want to honor what Judy was saying about the sort of definitional issues across the sort of landscape of biomass discussions, and wondering whether it's, you know, we have that opening statement, you know, about sort of what the definitions and other things that we're taking into account. I wonder if that is something that should be, whether, I don't know how to describe it in scope, but something that we, you know, sort of continue to work on and, you know, incorporate what we've learned along the way to make sure that we are being consistent. I don't like, I'm just, or being complete in that definition. I'm just trying to understand what that looks like.
Jane, can you go back up to that definition for a second? Because I have a thought, Peter, to that point.
Because I haven't looked at that definition enough. You know, the words matter, obviously, as we take a definition and try to apply it. So I just would want to make sure that I fully understood it.
So one thought I want to have Judy weigh in is, I think it's a working definition, which was intentional of the Eco Ag Subcommittee because it was the best we could give in the time we had. But I think we should put the working definition in blue, which is absolutely in scope for further discussion. But I want to see if Judy agrees with that or sees it differently.
I do agree, because on the front steps of McNeil, it defines biomass as organic material that can be used to create energy. And so hence their yard is full of logs.
Very different.
As well as wood chips.
So I think, Jane, maybe we just note that in our next version of this, we put the working definition in blue, because I think that Peter, you and Judy both raised a good point. Okay. All right. Sorry. Let's jump back down to the. So let me go back to the last. Oops, sorry.
Real quick, I'm keeping notes, and my intent would be to, if folks wanted to work in a small group or myself, I could take another shot at sort of pulling this together then based on this conversation as a coherent scope.
Great. Peter, do you have any other comments? All set. Okay, Judy, you all set for now, or do you have another different comment?
No, I'm set.
Okay, great. All right. So then yellow here, Jane, do you want to explain? So I think the intent, as Billy just said, is this is assumed this is actually under the task of the life cycle group, which includes some of you, by the way. And so this is kind of farmed off to that group because that's what their primary task is. Is that correct, Jane?
Yes.
Okay. So again, that's why that's in yellow. Any questions about that? And then the D, which is the pellet producing facilities in the state, which again could be what ones that produce pellets and who uses them, could vary in terms of usage. And then there's a whole set of potential recommendations here. And to Liz's earlier point, I think this is where the Ag and Eco Group recognized there needed to be a lot more discussion, because understanding the complexities of what kind of wood, trade-offs in like time between use and forest regeneration, as noted in the chat earlier, there's a bunch of complicated questions here in which we will need additional expertise. But D covers a lot of that, essentially the fuel source question vis-a-vis wood and if different functions it can provide and the co-benefits it provides in terms of either, woodlot, keeping woods in woodlot, providing cash flow to small woodlot owners, to keeping wood in storage and providing habitat, or the whole complicated set of things there. But that's, I think D is intended to be fully in scope, recognizing it's pretty complicated. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So I think, I think that first clause in number 1 that was read is a little complicated because it's kind of a clause. So I'm not sure if that's read or not, but I think the rest of it we kind of walk through. I'm not saying everybody loves this kind of approach, but it gives us kind of a focus to talk, really begin to focus on 2 things. Existing plants in particular and what it means to not have them be expanded if we have agreement and some of the details there. And then the question about kind of fuel source and its, interrelation between the multiple functions that wood can provide, whether it be fuel, and then whether or not actually it remains as storage or, in forest for a set of reasons. So anybody have any further questions about that kind of draft scope, which will at least allow us to begin to build agendas where we can begin to dive into the substance?
I ask a question. This was drafted as a set of recommendations, and it feels a little bit strange to have it as a scope with that, when they're not settled questions, as they're essentially questions that we're going to tackle. And I'm wondering if they could be reframed more to be the topic areas that we're going to discuss, rather than a specific set of outcomes that sort of, to my mind, prejudges a decision.
So I think Charlie says, yes, that would be helpful. I saw some other shaking of heads. So if we were to, ultimately, I think this group will have to come back to them as recommendations, decide whether or not you can, can't, or aren't sure to recommend them back to the council. But I think, Peter, to your point for scope, we need to kind of frame it as themes or issues or elements. So Jane, to that end, I wonder whether here's one thought so we get this right and do it quickly, so we don't have to do it in full group here, whether, one member of each of the 3 subcommittees, one of you from, if I get that right, one member of each of the subcommittees on this group works with Jane and me to kind of do that between this and the next meeting, so we can just name it and hopefully say, yes, it's great, and then dive in. Jane, what do you think?
Yeah, that would be fine. Just a reminder, this is not a subcommittee. And so I can take a first shot at this as a draft. And actually, if I can work with a subset, or I can share it in writing via email to all of you. And if you have comments or feedback, I can take it from everyone. So we have less rules sort of here in this group. So happy to take the shot at it and send it to everybody, or happy to work with a discrete group and then agree that the larger group will take that as the scope based on input from everybody.
Out of, what's your preference? I think it'd probably be more efficient if Jane just did that, send it out email to this group, you guys respond, Jane can edit, we bring her back to this group to finalize next time and just hopefully approve. Or do you want to have a smaller group work on it with her? It's really up to you all.
I'm fine with the former.
Judy?
Yeah, I'm fine with it. I have some concerns though. If every time we reduce this, the original intent could get lost. So does this, putting certain things in red here, does this mean we can never talk about that?
The way I would frame it, but I'm not sure if other people would, Judy, good question, is that what's in green is blue, whatever the color is in scope, is where we would focus. It doesn't mean we're not going to come back to say, did we miss something? Maybe the clean heat standard comes out and someone feels it missed something that was in the original recommendations. It doesn't mean that at some point we can't revisit to see if we've covered everything, but it gives us focus for where to go right now and direction and the intent.
Well, it's not only that, Patrick, it's listening to the heat committee struggle, because they don't know either.
I don't know, Jane or others, what you thought about kind of what the red does mean. I mean, I think it means it's not the primary focus of this group as we do our work. I'm not sure that it's meant to be totally exclusionary either, but Jane, what was your thinking?
Well, I mean, I think we've been demonstrating that. I think that at times they're hard to separate the two, wood for electricity and wood for heat. And so I imagine parts of it will merge into the conversation. But from a policy recommendation standpoint, I think the policies that will come out are going to be very much focused on what's in the blue now, because the red already doesn't feel it doesn't feel germane to actually spend time working on policy recommendations to go back up to the council that would be in conflict likely with other components of the cap.
As I would put even a finer point on it, I think the council has endorsed a thermal solution for greenhouse gas solution for thermal led efforts that includes wood heat as a solution. And anything that would call that into question, it feels like that matter has been settled by the council. And while there are ancillary issues around it, I feel like that conversation has been had, and I don't know if we have direction from the council to go back and look at that. And I would assume that as that was a part of the cap, that they have endorsed that. So I don't know how to do. I don't feel comfortable spending time on something that has already been addressed by the council.
And Peter, maybe one friendly amendment then Jane and Judy. And I would say, look, if anybody in this committee doesn't like what the legislature is doing, nothing stops you as a citizen for going to the legislature and addressing it in any way you wish to, right? I think Peter is referencing kind of this group as a arm of the council. Jane.
Yeah, I do just want to say that, you know, the way to get around some of this still will be the life cycle analysis and the way we think about biogenic emissions in the inventory and the supplemental analysis. We are doing a lot of research in that space. In addition to the life cycle analysis, there's also a Climate Alliance grant right now around the forest sector and looking at how we account for the forest sector in the land use sector, specifically in the inventory and supplemental tools in that space. So there are other ways that the council will sort of have a bite at this apple besides saying that they support or don't support wood heat as a clean heat option.
Judy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to address Peter because we talked about this on the week that you weren't there. The recommendations went to the council and that they were approved as our scope of work. And so that's why I'm concerned that's why the biomass committee was formed. And that's why I'm concerned about reducing it each time. And we do something to it and not having the ability to go back and ask a question or a comment or make a comparison to something that was already X'd out.
So I might have a question then for you, Judy. It was not my understanding that the full set of recommendations were endorsed by the council as the scope of this group, but as the starting point for the discussions. And so I feel like that's a different statement than a scope. And so if I'm wrong, please let me know, but and others should weigh in, but it was my understanding that this was the starting point for our conversation. And now we're having that conversation to advance.
Well, that's not how I took it, but you're entitled to your opinion. The conversation we had at that first meeting was pretty clear. This is where we were going to go.
My take, for what it's worth, is we could debate this among ourselves and not come to agreement. We could certainly send it back to the council, who might or might not provide any more greater clarity on scope. So my take is what the blue allows us to do is start our conversation and focus in those areas. And in the red, if we disagree, we know it's not going to be the first thing we talk about, but we certainly can look at it as we get to the work done through the blue. And if someone feels strongly we haven't talked about some of those things in red, we can rediscuss that. But I think if we constantly try to litigate the red in or out, it's just going to slow us down. And I know people are anxious to dive in. So this is a mediator's trick, which can be very unsatisfying, which is we don't have agreement on the red necessarily on this group. Let's put it to the end. It's neither in nor out. We work on the blue, and then we've done good work on the blue. We kind of see what's left with the red, whether we redebate that, we're done with that because we've already feel like we've done a good job, or someone gives us further direction. So that's my sense of what would help us move forward. But you all are the boss here. So. Thoughts on that, or other points about the back and forth a bit on the red stuff?
I feel better with going with what you just said. The red is neither in or out. focus on the blue first, and then if we need to discuss the red, we can bring it back in.
People live with that?
Yeah, I actually feel strongly that I feel strongly that the way it was presented actually is that the tabled actions were the start for the formation of the scope. And that yes, there are issues that will trickle in from that red, that I don't know why we would spend time relitigating components that are already included as primary recommendations in the cap. I'm just going to put that out there only because I'm not sure to what end that would serve this group. Yeah, so just going to state that.
I'd like to respond to that, Jane. The reason I
you.
don't want to throw it out is because so many subcommittees told us they did not have time to include equity.
Billy, did you have a further point?
No.
So I hear you, Judy, and that's one of the main reasons why the conversation at the in the primary committee that was looking at the clean heat standard is trying to figure out ways to better incorporate equity into the considerations that the PUC puts into place for the clean heat standard. And so that's why I get precisely where you're coming from, but I just, that's I think the committee, the House Energy and Technology Committee, heard that feedback, and that's why they incorporated a specific equity, I can't remember, as advisory committee or something, into the process.
So I think here's, and Jane, this is probably this is like a process question vis-a-vis the council. I think rather than, if we can't agree on kind of leaving red neither in nor out, and people feel strongly, some people feel strongly it needs to be answered one way or the other, then I think that's the council's job to solve that scope problem, because I think we'll just go back and forth. So I guess the question is, do we let it to the side and address it later if we decide we need to have like neither in nor out as Judy described, or do you want the council to clarify? Maybe folks who've been quiet on the work group here, let me know what you think, and then we'll kind of see where we are. So I don't know, Richard, do you have a view of this one way or the other? Liz, how about you?
I agree with what Jane and Peter raised in terms of what I thought the purpose was here. It was a starting point. So yeah, I don't have more to add.
TJ?
I guess I don't have super strong feelings on it either way, so I don't have anything to add.
Charlie?
I guess part of me feels a little bit like we're just talking in circles. And I think we're gonna redefine what we've got as our scope of work, like we talked about, and we can get that into a place we're comfortable with and move forward. And then as far as saying anything that goes against a cap recommendation, that makes total sense to me. I always saw our work as kind of saying, okay, like if we're going to recommend doing this, like accelerating the development of thermal heat residential use, maybe our goal was to talk about how we did it. So it was less about the what and more about the how. So that's my 2 cents.
Billy?
I generally agree that it's not a good use of our time to focus on issues that have been settled in the plan and maybe put into law before we even conclude our conversations.
So let's, Charlie, maybe let me take up your suggestion, which is I think we want to, Jane's going to work on kind of redrafting the core recommendations as kind of elements of a scope. Why don't we see that, people can comment, and then we can decide whether, in terms of the red items, we can decide whether, we leave them kind of uncertain or we send them back to the council to ask what to do with. But maybe to Charlie's point, let's just get things written up first, and we can take a look at it. Peter.
Yeah, I guess to that point, and I think Charlie is right that there's work that's needed in the how we do it space, but that is built into the legislation. And so, we would be duplicating a process that has sort of legal standing were the bill to pass. And so it feels like I'm happy to include it as things we should also bear in mind as we do our work to see where else it falls, right? If the bill doesn't pass and there's further consideration of the clean heat standard, then some work there might be in informational, but I think we need to make sure that we're clear about what that value is, because I'm not sure this is the space to inform that conversation, since it's been taken up by the policymakers of the state of Vermont.
Right. So I think why don't we, Jane, thank you for kind of being one to kind of put stuff propositions out there so we can be focused, which has been very helpful today. I think we've got some direction about the kind of the blue and putting that in scope. Red uncertain, let's put this in kind of a scope language. We'll look at it via email, some back and forth. We'll then bring it forward to this group and hopefully can finalize that next time. And if we need further direction from council, we can ask for it next meeting. Okay. All right. What I'd like to do, I want to talk a little bit about kind of where we go from here in terms of the blue and what we do. But I want to maybe, now is probably a good time for a brief chance to give any public comment. So if people want to make a brief public comment, now would be a good time to do it. And then I'm going to just talk a little bit about next steps and how we kind of start diving into the substance. So anybody wants to make a public comment, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Jennifer. And Jennifer, when you make a public comment, it's great to see your face if you want to turn on your camera. And Jennifer, you're still on mute there. So, oh, great. There you are. Hi.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for doing all this hard work. I just wanted to advocate for the notion of providing as much feedback on as many of these dimensions as you can. And I know that you have a particular focus. And I know that the color coding is going to help with that. But I think in the end, this is a unique chance for the state of Vermont to really get a handle on how the accounting occurs and what the ramifications of heat and electricity are using wood, and what the ramifications are for the forest. And we have a chance, I think, as the state of Vermont, to be a leader in this. And so I think when your work is done, to then come back in with a statement of what needs to be worked on further would be great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Thanks so much. Okay, so I think that we'll work on an agenda for next time, and we'll begin to dive into one of these conversations, which will clarify the scope, hopefully pretty quickly, and then dive in. And Jane and I'll talk and let you maybe suggest you via email some suggestions for how we get started. We are going to likely need to call on expertise for some of these topics that we don't have within this group. So what I want to do before we start talking about which expert you'd like to bring to the group, if we can get them, is really just talk about the criteria for the expertise you would call on. So I just as so kind of criteria or principles. So I can throw out two ideas just to start, and then I want you guys to riff on this. And we can do that for 5-10 minutes. Then we'll do next steps and close by the time. So my take is there's two things I might suggest. One is, I think Judy named one, which is if there's an agency with jurisdiction, data, expertise in a topic, if that staff person or staff people are available, one kind of expertise we'd call on is agency expertise, like, for instance, whoever may regulate air quality at McNeil and has data. So that would be one example. The other example would be, I think, experts who are really technical people who have done, for instance, if someone has done a detailed study like Buchholz, if that's the name, around kind of the life cycle of wood pellets and vis-a-vis carbon emissions, vis-a-vis forest as storage and sequestration, that kind of expertise, and really focus on people who've done technical analysis or work trying to understand these complex issues. And what I might suggest is that there are many policy experts who are super expert, but they have very particularly strong views that are informed by those other studies and work scientists have done, but they're not the scientists who've done the work itself. And I would discourage us from those folks because their opinion in some ways is no better informed than yours, or maybe it's better informed, but it's an opinion, just like yours will be. And so I would encourage you to think about how much you want policy people versus those scientists or technical experts or consulting firms or whatever who've kind of done the core scientific work. And so that may be hard to distinguish sometimes, but it's one thought I thought about as we talk about criteria for who you might ask to come talk to you. So with that, love to hear not who you want to talk to yet, but the kinds of people that you think will be most helpful given the blue that we've outlined. Thoughts on criteria? Peter and then Charlie. And we'll take those here.
I may defer to Charlie here since he's an expert in the field, but I feel like we're making a lot of recommendations around the operations of things related to biomass, whether that be pellet mills or the harvesting of wood that I know nothing about, and don't, want to, anytime we're making best management practices, it's helpful to understand what normal practices are and understand whether there's improvements to be made upon them. And so I would think of that as some pretty critical expertise for us to bring to bear.
So kind of like operational expertise or experience.
Yeah, foresters, people in the sort of wood industry as a whole, I think would probably be of value.
Charlie?
Yeah, I agree with Peter. I think it would be great to bring in an individual or individuals that can give us a really accurate view of kind of what the current playing field looks like. And these are folks that are not necessarily policymakers. They're folks like Paul Frederick at PDR. Well, I shouldn't know individual name, but yeah, somebody who can come in and talk to like what's going on with the industry, how things work presently, would be great. So we have a clear understanding of kind of what the current situation looks like. And then to your point, Patrick, I would just agree wholeheartedly that when we look at research, we should be going to the primary sources of the research. One of my biggest concerns is that oftentimes in these discussions, we start quoting or calling from papers that are basically literature reviews and not the primary sources of the research that's being quoted. And so when we do pull in people like that, I would just wholeheartedly ask that we actually go to the primary sources. Thank you.
Good, thank you. And what I'll do is let me take work group comments first, but I'll make sure there's a chance for public comment on this too before we close. So Cheryl, stay hold for a bit, but I'll definitely call on you at the end. Judy.
I agree, Patrick, that getting people who do the research is using wisdom. However, foresters are not the people necessarily who do the research. That was the problem we had at the Ag and Ecosystems Committee. We had opinions entering into the story because they only work in their silo unless they're a specific researcher. And so I think sticking with researchers and not having foresters with one opinion from their silo coming is the best thing. That's how we ran into trouble before.
Thanks, Judy. Liz.
I just wanted to note, I think it was through the doodle poll you sent out. I can't quite remember, but I took the time to kind of put together a list of folks that at least, again, as a representative specifically appointed from the utility sector, that was my lens and should be my lens. So I provided a list, and I just want to make sure Patrick and Jane, you have that so that it's taken into account. I don't have it sitting in front of me, but it was, I recall there were UVM researchers on it, as well as folks associated with the McNeil plant, because if we're going to talk about operating facilities, feels like we should be hearing from those operating facilities, and others. So it was, it wasn't just a single lens focus in terms of the individuals, but I remember providing that when I was asked to join this subcommittee.
And
so if that doesn't sound familiar, let me know.
Because if we can't find it, we may have to torture you to ask it one more time. But
I hope to gosh you can, just because I don't know where I'd find it, but I'm sure I can dig it up if you can.
Well,
we all sent in recommendations in response to one of your letters.
And Judy, it might have been that survey and Liz. So what we'll do is we'll go back to those results and put those in one place.
I think that's exactly right. I bet a bunch of folks did the same thing, and it would be really great to consolidate those, and then we can kind of see who each other recommended. I bet there's a lot of overlap, and then when there's not, we can figure it out.
So the two things I heard so far, and then I'll go to Cheryl so she can comment, is that I think one is primary sources to the extent possible, as I heard, is an important criteria. And then I think if we draw on operational people, it's not to ask them what should be, it's to ask them what is. So in other words, how do you do things? I think Charlie said it, if we do operational people who have biases or their silos, as Judy noted, it's not so much to ask what we should do, it's just to understand what is happening currently. So they're a source for kind of what is. Those are the kind of the two things that I heard. Cheryl, you wanted to comment on this topic, so over to you.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I think it's really, the problem with only getting just the researcher is the fact that when you're doing research, you know, sometimes it's a really narrow focus, not sometimes, really always. And so, you know, there are some really valuable people to talk about things when they are doing literature reviews or, you know, research reviews, and they'll do, you know, you have the people putting all of the information together, and to leave that as something that's not available makes it a little difficult, especially on something such as a forest, which is such a large, you know, ecology is really a very big field. It's not, you know, it's too large, broadly focused to be able to leave something like that out. I think just the researcher is narrowing the availability of people with a lot of good information to share.
Thanks, Cheryl. I've got Isaac, I think, has a comment as well.
Yeah, sure. So my comment is sort of similar to what was just said. I think we need to be clear that there is nothing but opinion on this subject because of the limitations of the research. And so, for instance, below ground soil carbon dynamics have been studied, but they haven't been studied across a broad enough sector of ecosystems to really do anything except for point in a potential direction. And so I think sometimes these policy experts or people that might not be doing primary research would be helpful in aggregating where things stand scientifically, with the understanding that there could be some level of personal bias, but that in this conversation, you cannot have an opinion without being personally biased. And that includes scientists doing primary research, except for they might be able to more clearly describe the limitations of our knowledge. And so just wanted to point out that I don't think there are unbiased people, and I don't think that we can, I think that's where the literature stands.
I think a few of you are naming what I'm going to lack of terms I'm going to call aggregators of information and knowledge, again, who may have a bias, but are trying to assimilate lots of information to see what can be known and not known today. So Billy, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to apologize. I had received a very frustrating message while Cheryl was speaking, and I muttered some comments under my breath and wasn't muted, and they were not intended at her comments. It was the email that I was reading next to her video. So I don't know if anyone caught it, but if they did, I just want to apologize and clarify it wasn't intended at anything folks were saying here.
No problem. So if you receive an irritating text or email from your teenage daughter or son or otherwise, please go on mute briefly to receive and react. New ground rule.
Exactly. Exactly.
I don't know if I would ever be able to come off mute, just for the record.
That's well, soon you maybe will be able to, because you'll have a different job. All right, this is very helpful. I've heard three things of these: primary sources, folks with direct operational experience recognizing they may have biases, and then aggregators recognizing that they may be able to assimilate lots of information, even if they do have a bias. We'll, to Liz's and Judy's point, we will go look at the survey and see if we can find those names you already gave us. I think Jane and I'll work to try to craft an agenda and maybe even a little bit of a work plan now that we begin to have some direction here. We'll bring back the scope as elements and then try to start diving into the conversation very soon. We have just a few minutes left. So Jane, I want to go to Standing Tree here in just a second to comment for public comment, but anything else, Jane, operationally or organizationally we need to do? And Judy has a good next
put in the chat exactly what I came off mute to do. I'm more than happy to do that via email if it's too hard to do as a group, but I guess if anybody has a day that does not work for a standing meeting, you can say that now and I'll try to narrow it down from that, but otherwise I'll try to do it in a poll.
Jane, we agreed to meet every month. I'm trying to remember how much what we could tolerate for frequency.
Actually, that maybe that would be helpful.
We attend
If we could
some-
be on a cadence of the meetings and the length of the meetings, that would help me then set a recurring meeting.
I think when we surveyed people, we might have asked, but real quickly, I for some reason I'm remembering, and I may be completely wrong because that's the case of my memory these days, is that did we agree to roughly monthly, that was about what people would tolerate, or did we agree to something more frequent than that?
I can't believe I'm gonna say this, but I mostly because there's so many meetings, but just to put that in perspective, if we haven't talked about a timeline for completion of this work, but originally this was supposed to go back to the council in the spring. As I think I alluded to all of you, the transportation work has kicked out to the fall. If you wanted to keep a similar cadence and try to have some recommendations that went back to the council in the fall, meeting monthly would only give you 6 meetings. So.
Well, Jane,
I'll just say all other task groups are meeting bi-weekly, except for the transportation task group that's meeting weekly.
so why don't we do this for now? Why don't we try to schedule a meeting roughly 2 weeks out? And we'll do that via email, and then we can, why don't we just, people think about frequency, and if, again, about every other week roughly is tolerable or not, and we can ask that question at the beginning of the next meeting. Partly to even both Jane and Cheryl's point that it would be hard to finish if we don't probably meet a little bit more frequently. Okay, so we'll follow up with that, Judy. Good question. Okay, Zach, final public comment for today. Over to you.
Thanks. Zach Porter, I'm the director of Standing Trees. Appreciate the chance to comment today. I want to just make sure that public health experts are also on your list of people to talk to. And so, in addition to all the other experts that were just mentioned, that has to be a part of the conversation too here. We can't just be looking at the carbon. In the same way, speaking to, experts in like was said earlier, forest ecology and biodiversity. We don't want to have blinders on to the other issues that are inherent here. So just making sure that those other voices are on our list of people to reach out to. Thank you.
Exactly. Great. And Richard might reinforce that as well. So thank you. Okay. All right. I think there we go. Got a thumbs up. Nicely. Good. All right. Peter, you said your last day is when?
My last day is April 15th, but I think I'm going to assume that this is likely my final meeting, as I will have many things to wrap up in advance of that time. So I think it's highly unlikely that I will be available for another meeting. So you should not plan around my calendar for that process.
Okay. We wish you the best and very well, and thank you for your help to date. And we look forward to not your replacement, but an alternate or alternative to you when they arrive. So thank you so much, Peter.
As TJ said, he looks forward to being improved upon. So I think that sounds great.
Very, very good. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. We'll be in touch soon with some of the materials we talked about this afternoon. Thanks all.
Thank you all.